Life as a frontier sheriff was brutal, deadly, and short. It wasn't about heroic showdowns or taming the Wild West. It was about surviving a job that killed most men within their first year. The real question isn't whether it was dangerous, it's whether you could do it. Becoming a frontier sheriff didn't start with an application. It started with survival skills learned young. Boys in the West grew up handling firearms by age 7 or 8. Not for sport, but for protection and food. Your childhood was target practice, learning to ride, and understanding that hesitation got you killed. By 12, you could shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces, or you were probably already dead from snakebite. There were no police academies, no training programs, no qualifications. Most sheriffs got the job because literally nobody else wanted it. Frontier towns held elections where the prize for winning was a tin badge and a high probability of death. Campaigns consisted of standing in a saloon convincing drunk miners you were tough enough to arrest them later. Some sheriffs were former outlaws themselves. Towns figured if you'd survived years of crime, you might survive years of stopping it. The logic was twisted but effective. Who better to catch a horse thief than someone who used to steal horses? One famous Arizona sheriff had been a cattle rustler before switching sides. He knew every trick because he'd invented half of them. Age requirements didn't exist. The experience requirements were optional. The main qualification was being willing to walk toward gunfire while everyone else ran away. One Kansas town elected a 19-year-old sheriff simply because he was the only applicant. He lasted 3 weeks before a bullet ended his career permanently. Training was whatever the previous sheriff taught you before he died, quit, or fled town in the middle of the night. Sometimes that was valuable wisdom about reading men and avoiding ambushes. Other times it was just don't stand in front of windows and sleep with your boots on. If the previous sheriff was dead, which was common, you learned by trial and error. Emphasis on error. The oath of office was simple. Uphold the law, protect citizens, and try not to get murdered. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. Your badge was usually tin or brass, pinned to your chest like a target. Some sheriffs wore it inside their coat to avoid advertising their position. Others wore it proudly on display. The proud ones died faster. You couldn't quit easily either. Some towns made sheriffs sign contracts with financial penalties for breaking them. Others used social pressure. Quitting meant you were a coward, and cowards didn't last long in frontier communities where reputation was everything. So you stayed, knowing every sunrise might be your last, because the alternative was worse than death, being known as the man who ran. After accepting the badge, you'd quickly realize the job came with equipment that was barely adequate and expectations that were completely unreasonable. A frontier sheriff's equipment list was depressingly short. You got a badge, a gun if you were lucky, and a jail cell that probably couldn't hold a determined drunk. Everything else you bought yourself, assuming you lived long enough to collect a paycheck. The revolver was your primary tool and your best friend. Most sheriffs carried a Colt single-action army or similar 6-shooter. These weren't the lightning-fast weapons Hollywood shows. They were heavy, inaccurate beyond 25 yards, and required manual cocking between shots. Reloading took 30 to 45 seconds, an eternity when someone's shooting back at you. Ammunition was expensive, costing about a day's wages for a box of 50 cartridges. Practice shooting? That was a luxury most sheriffs couldn't afford. Many lawmen fired their weapons only a handful of times before facing actual gunfights. Imagine learning to drive by immediately entering a demolition derby. That was frontier law enforcement. Some sheriffs carried shotguns for close quarters work. A 12-gauge loaded with buckshot didn't require much aim, which was helpful when your hands were shaking and your target was drunk, angry, and armed. The downside was shotguns were heavy, slow to reload, and made you look like you were expecting trouble, which you were, always. Rifles stayed in the office or on your horse. Winchester repeaters were popular, 15 rounds of .44-40 ammunition that could drop a man at 200 yards, but carrying a rifle around town made you look paranoid. Then again, paranoid sheriffs lived longer than trusting ones. The West rewarded suspicion and punished faith in human nature. Handcuffs were rare and expensive, so most sheriffs used rope or chains. Prisoners escaped regularly by rubbing rope against rocks, picking simple locks, or just waiting until you fell asleep. One Arizona sheriff tied up a prisoner who simply walked to a nearby boulder, rubbed the rope against it for an hour, and disappeared into the desert. The sheriff found him 3 days later, dehydrated but free. Your office doubled as the jail, and most frontier jails were architectural jokes. Single rooms with iron bars if you were lucky, reinforced sheds if you weren't. Some were just regular buildings with a lock on the door. Determined prisoners could kick through walls, dig under foundations, or wait until you dozed off and steal your keys. Security systems consisted of you staying awake forever. Communication was non-existent in any modern sense. No radios, no phones, no way to call for backup. If trouble started on one end of town while you were on the other, you found out when someone ran to tell you. By then, the trouble had usually multiplied or disappeared entirely. Some sheriffs hired deputies, but that meant splitting your already pathetic salary. Most worked alone. Transportation was your horse, assuming you owned one. A decent horse cost $50 to $100, several months' salary for most lawmen. Without one, you chased outlaws on foot while they rode away laughing. With one, you had something valuable that outlaws wanted to steal. Either way, you lost. Horses also needed feeding, shoeing, and care, adding more expenses to a job that barely paid. The relationship between a sheriff and his equipment was simple. It was never enough. Never reliable enough, never powerful enough, never sufficient for the job demanded. But it was all you had, so you made it work or you didn't make it at all. Some sheriffs obsessed over their weapons, cleaning them daily, practicing draws in private. Others treated them like tools, maintaining them just enough to function. Both groups died at roughly the same rate. With your inadequate equipment secured, the real work began, and that work started before most people woke up. A frontier sheriff's day started at dawn, assuming you slept at all. Most didn't. Sleeping meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant waking up with a knife in your ribs or not waking up at all. Smart sheriffs took naps in random locations at random times, never establishing patterns that enemies could exploit. Morning rounds began with checking your jail. Had prisoners escaped during the night? Were they still breathing? Both scenarios created paperwork, though one created significantly more. Then you walked the town, checking doors and windows, looking for signs of burglary or trouble, and reminding everyone through your presence that law existed here, even if barely. Breakfast was whatever you could afford or whatever the local restaurant gave you for free in exchange for protection. Some sheriffs ate well, enjoying eggs and bacon. Others survived on coffee and hardtack biscuits that could break teeth. The coffee was always terrible. Grounds boiled in water until it resembled mud and tasted worse. You drank it anyway because staying alert kept you alive. The saloons opened around 10 a.m., and that's when your real job started. Drunk cowboys, gamblers, miners, and drifters created a toxic mix of testosterone, alcohol, and loaded weapons. Fights erupted over card games, women, perceived insults, or absolutely nothing at all. Your job was stopping them before someone died, which was harder than it sounds. Breaking up fights meant walking into a room full of armed, intoxicated men and convincing them to calm down through words or force. Diplomacy worked sometimes. Other times you cracked skulls with your pistol grip and dragged unconscious troublemakers to jail by their boots. The line between peacekeeping and assault was thin and frequently crossed. Nobody cared as long as order was restored. Afternoons brought different problems that were somehow worse than violence. Disputes over property lines, accusations of theft, domestic violence, and business disagreements all landed on your desk. You were sheriff, judge, mediator, and therapist rolled into one exhausted person. Legal training? None. You made decisions based on common sense and hoped nobody shot you for getting it wrong. Paperwork was surprisingly extensive for a frontier job. Arrest reports, property records, incident logs, court documents, all handwritten by candlelight with a pen that constantly needed dipping in ink. Many sheriffs were barely literate, making this especially painful. Spelling was optional. Accuracy was aspirational. As long as you documented something, the territorial government was satisfied. Patrols continued throughout the day, walking the same dusty streets repeatedly, showing your face, making your presence known. The theory was visibility prevented crime. The reality was it made you an easy target for anyone holding a grudge. Smart sheriffs varied their routes and timing. Predictable sheriffs got ambushed in alleys and died confused. Evenings were the most dangerous time of any day. Saloons filled up, tempers shortened, and weapons came out over the smallest provocations. You made constant rounds, stepping into establishments, scanning for trouble, reminding people you existed. Presence prevented some crimes. Others happened anyway, and you responded to gunshots, screams, or someone running to fetch you while shouting incoherently. Night brought a different kind of terror that was somehow worse than daylight violence. Darkness hid threats everywhere. Every shadow could conceal an enemy with a gun. Walking down unlit streets meant exposing yourself to ambush from any direction. Some sheriffs carried lanterns, making themselves visible targets. Others moved in darkness, hoping to see threats before threats saw them. Both strategies got people killed regularly. Sleep was a luxury scheduled around prisoner checks, patrol rounds, and paranoia. Most sheriffs slept in their offices, fully clothed, boots on, gun within reach, on the desk or under the pillow. Light sleepers survived. Heavy sleepers became cautionary tales told in saloons. One sheriff was stabbed to death in his sleep by a prisoner's brother who'd picked the office lock. After that, most lawmen slept sitting up in chairs. The routine was relentless and never-ending. No weekends, no holidays, no sick days. If you were too injured to work, you were too injured to keep the job. Towns didn't pay sheriffs to recover. They replaced them. The badge transferred to the next volunteer, and you became another former lawman trying to survive with whatever skills you had left, and a body that didn't work right anymore. And some days were quiet, and those were actually the worst because you knew violence was just delayed, not prevented. The calm was temporary, and when it broke hard and fast. Experienced sheriffs could feel it coming. A tension in the air, a change in how people looked at you, a sudden absence of the usual troublemakers. Something was being planned, and you were probably the target. But routine dangers were manageable compared to what happened when someone decided you needed to die. Hollywood gunfights are choreographed dances with dramatic music. Real frontier gunfights were chaotic, terrifying, and over in seconds. There were no dramatic countdowns, no honor, no fair play, just sudden violence and permanent consequences that left bodies in the street. Most gunfights started without any warning at all. Someone you arrested last month ambushed you from an alley. A drunk cowboy decided you disrespected him by looking at him wrong. A gang rode into town specifically to kill you because you'd killed their friend. The first shot came before you knew you were in danger, and if it hit, you were already dead. Accuracy was terrible even among experienced shooters. Adrenaline flooded your system, hands shook, vision tunneled, and fine motor skills disappeared completely. One documented gunfight involved two men firing 17 shots at each other from 15 feet away. Total hits, 0. They eventually gave up and left, both unharmed and probably embarrassed. When bullets did connect, the results were devastating and immediate. A .45 caliber round created massive wound channels, shattered bones, and caused catastrophic bleeding. Gut shots meant slow, agonizing deaths over days as your insides rotted. Chest shots drowned you in your own blood. Head shots were instant but rare because heads were small, moving targets. Most men died slowly, painfully, and fully aware of what was happening to them. The famous quick draw was mostly myth and Hollywood invention. Real gunfights favored whoever shot first, not fastest. Sheriffs who survived learned to shoot from the hip, fire through coat pockets, or draw while diving for cover. Style didn't matter, survival did. Looking cool while dying was still dying. Multiple opponents were common and usually fatal. Outlaws traveled in groups for safety and intimidation. If you arrested one, his friends came looking for revenge. Suddenly you faced 3 or 4 armed men while you had 6 shots and no backup. The math was simple and brutal. Some sheriffs survived through luck or exceptional skill. Most didn't survive at all. Bystanders complicated everything in ways that got innocent people killed. Frontier towns had no concept of clear line of fire. Gunfights happened in crowded saloons, busy streets, and packed gambling halls. Missed shots hit innocent people. Ricochets killed children playing nearby. One sheriff fired at an outlaw, missed, and killed a pregnant woman standing behind him. He quit the next day and never wore a badge again. Cover was critical, but often inadequate. Wooden buildings offered concealment but not protection. Bullets passed through walls easily. Stone or brick was better but rare in frontier towns built quickly and cheaply. Many sheriffs died because they hid behind materials that looked solid but weren't. One sheriff crouched behind a water barrel during a shootout. The bullets went through the water, through the barrel, and through him. Reloading during gunfights was nearly impossible and usually fatal. 6 shots. Then you were fumbling with cartridges while being shot at. Some sheriffs carried 2 revolvers to double their capacity. Others carried speed loaders, metal strips holding 6 rounds. Most just died before reloading became necessary, which solved the problem permanently. The psychological aftermath was rarely discussed but universally experienced by survivors. Killing someone, even in self-defense, left scars that never healed. Some sheriffs became alcoholics, drinking to forget faces and screams. Others developed what we now call PTSD. Nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, violent outbursts. No counseling existed. You either dealt with it alone or you didn't deal with it at all. Wounded sheriffs faced another nightmare that was often worse than the gunfight itself: frontier medicine. Getting shot was bad. Getting treated for it was often worse. Frontier medicine combined genuine ignorance with treatment so dangerous they frequently finished what bullets started. The first challenge was finding a doctor, which wasn't guaranteed. Many frontier towns had none at all. The closest medical professional might be 50 miles away, accessible only by agonizing horseback ride that could take hours or days. Some sheriffs bled out before reaching help. Others died from shock during the journey, bouncing on horseback with bullets still inside them. When doctors existed, their training varied wildly from legitimate to laughable. Some had genuine medical degrees from Eastern universities. Others had read a book once and decided that qualified them to cut people open. One famous frontier doctor admitted he'd been a veterinarian before treating humans, figuring the principles were similar enough. They weren't, and his patients discovered this the hard way. Bullet extraction was medieval torture disguised as medicine. No anesthesia beyond whiskey, which didn't actually numb pain. It just made you too drunk to care as much while someone dug around inside you. Doctors probed wounds with unwashed fingers or metal instruments, searching for bullets by feel. Screaming was expected. Passing out was common. Infection was virtually guaranteed. Sterilization didn't exist as a concept most frontier doctors understood or practiced. Germ theory was still controversial in medical circles back east, and frontier doctors certainly didn't believe in it. Instruments were wiped on dirty cloths between patients. Surgeons operated in street clothes covered in previous patients' blood. Wounds were packed with whatever was available: cloth, paper, sometimes tobacco. The tobacco was supposed to prevent infection through some mysterious property. It didn't. It just added tobacco to your infected wound. Amputation was the solution to many problems, applied liberally. Shattered limb? Amputate. Infected wound? Amputate. Bullet lodged near bone? Amputate. The procedure involved a saw, some whiskey for the patient, and hope. Survival rates hovered around 50%. The other 50% died from blood loss, shock, or subsequent infection that turned their stump gangrenous. Pain management was primitive and often created new problems. Laudanum, liquid opium, was the primary painkiller. It worked, but created addiction quickly. Many wounded sheriffs became dependent, trading one misery for another. Others refused it entirely, preferring agonizing pain to the fog of addiction. Both choices were terrible in different ways. Recovery locations were wherever you could afford, which usually wasn't much. Wealthy sheriffs rented rooms in boarding houses. Poor ones recovered in their jail cells, lying on the same cots as their prisoners. Infection, fever, and delirium were expected parts of healing. If you survived 2 weeks without dying from infection, you'd probably survive permanently. Probably. Permanent disabilities were common among surviving sheriffs. Shattered bones healed crooked, leaving limbs twisted. Nerve damage left arms or legs partially paralyzed. Lung wounds caused chronic breathing problems and constant coughing. Many sheriffs returned to duty with significant impairments, unable to afford retirement and too proud to quit. They worked until their disabilities killed them or someone else did. The psychological impact of frontier medicine added another layer of trauma to an already traumatic job. Knowing that getting shot meant probable death or permanent disability changed how sheriffs approached their work. Some became more cautious, avoiding confrontations when possible. Others became reckless, figuring a quick death beat a slow one. Neither approach guaranteed survival. For those who survived wounds and treatment, another harsh reality awaited that somehow felt worse than physical pain. The job barely paid enough to justify the risks. Frontier sheriffs earned between $50 and $150 per month, depending on the town's size and wealth. That sounds reasonable until you realize what it actually bought and what it didn't cover. A decent meal cost 50 cents. Room and board ran $20 to $30 monthly. Ammunition, clothing, and equipment came from your own pocket. After basic expenses, most sheriffs had $10 to $20 left over. That's what your life was worth. About 50 cents per day, less than what most people paid for lunch. Payment schedules were unreliable at best and non-existent at worst. Towns paid monthly, theoretically. In practice, payments came late or not at all. Frontier economies were unstable. Mines closed, cattle drives ended, and suddenly, the town couldn't afford its sheriff. You worked anyway, hoping payment would eventually arrive. Sometimes it did. Sometimes you just accumulated IOUs that were worthless. Fee systems supplemented income if you were aggressive about it. Sheriffs earned extra for serving warrants, transporting prisoners, and collecting taxes. These fees ranged from $1 to $5 per task. Ambitious sheriffs could double their income through fees. Lazy ones starved. The system incentivized aggressive law enforcement, which sometimes meant arresting people for questionable reasons just to earn the fee. Bounties offered another income source that was tempting but dangerous. Wanted outlaws had prices on their heads, $50 to $500 for dangerous criminals, sometimes more for notorious ones. Catching them meant extra money, assuming you survived the attempt. Some sheriffs became bounty hunters, chasing rewards across territories. Others stuck to local work, figuring staying alive beat getting rich and dead. Expenses constantly exceeded income in a cycle that never ended. Replacing a stolen horse cost 3 months' salary. Medical treatment after a gunfight cost another month. New boots, ammunition, and equipment repairs added up quickly. Most sheriffs lived in perpetual debt, borrowing against future paychecks that might never arrive because they might be dead before payday. Retirement planning didn't exist in any meaningful sense. No pensions, no savings accounts, no safety nets. You worked until you died, got fired, or became too injured to continue. Former sheriffs often ended up as night watchmen, saloon bouncers, or beggars on the same streets they once protected. The lucky ones had families to support them. The unlucky ones died alone and broke in unmarked graves. The financial calculation was brutal and obvious to everyone. You risked your life daily for wages that barely covered survival. Meanwhile, the outlaws you chased often had more money than you'd earn in a lifetime. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Some sheriffs switched sides, figuring if they were going to be poor and hunted, they might as well be rich and hunted. Comparing sheriff pay to other professions highlighted the absurdity of the job. Bartenders earned similar wages with zero risk of death. Blacksmiths made more and kept all their fingers. Even prostitutes had better job security and health outcomes. Being a sheriff was financially irrational, which raises the question, why did anyone do it? For some, it was pride and ego. For others, necessity and lack of options. A few genuinely believed in law and order. Most just needed a job, and this was available when nothing else was. Whatever the reason, they accepted poverty as the price of the badge, along with everything else the job demanded. But even worse than the financial struggles was how society treated the men who wore that badge. Frontier sheriffs occupied a strange social position, simultaneously respected and despised, needed and resented. Their status shifted depending on who you asked and what the sheriff had done lately. Respectable citizens, merchants, bankers, families generally supported sheriffs in theory. These people wanted order, safety, and predictability for their businesses and children. A good sheriff meant their businesses thrived and their children didn't witness murders in the street. They praised lawmen publicly and sometimes even invited them to dinner. Sometimes. But even respectable support had limits that were clearly defined. Sheriffs were employees, not equals. They weren't invited to join social clubs or marry into prominent families. One sheriff described his position as useful but not welcome, like a necessary tool you kept in the shed, not the house. You were appreciated for your function, not your person. Cowboys, miners, and drifters, the people sheriffs actually policed, viewed lawmen with open hostility. To them, sheriffs were oppressors enforcing arbitrary rules that ruined their fun. Why couldn't they shoot their guns in town? Why couldn't they settle disputes with fists? The sheriff said so, and they hated him for it. This resentment created constant tension that could explode into violence. Every arrest made enemies, every fine created grudges. Sheriffs walked through towns knowing half the population wanted them dead. Some threats were explicit, men promising to kill you once they got out of jail. Others were just hostile stares and muttered curses. Both were exhausting. Outlaws obviously hated sheriffs, but their hatred was at least honest and straightforward. They were criminals. You were law enforcement. The relationship was clear. What hurt more was betrayal by people you'd protected. Sheriffs who arrested popular figures, even guilty ones, faced community backlash. Suddenly, the man who'd kept them safe was the villain. Women's perspectives varied wildly based on their circumstances. Some saw sheriffs as heroes, brave men standing between civilization and chaos. Others saw them as violent, dangerous, and poor marriage prospects. The job's mortality rate made sheriffs risky partners. Why marry a man who'd probably be dead within a year, leaving you a widow with children to feed? Children idolized sheriffs until they understood what the job actually involved. Then idolization turned to pity or fear. One former sheriff recalled a child asking him why he chose to do something so scary. He had no good answer because there wasn't one. You didn't choose it. It chose you, or circumstances did. Other lawmen were complicated allies at best. Sheriffs in neighboring towns sometimes cooperated, sharing information and assisting with captures. Other times they competed for bounties, jurisdiction, and credit. Professional jealousy was common. So was schadenfreude when a rival sheriff got killed. One less competitor for limited resources and glory. The press portrayed sheriffs inconsistently depending on their agenda. Eastern newspapers romanticized them as noble frontier heroes taming the Wild West. Local papers were more honest, reporting their failures, corruption, and deaths with equal enthusiasm. Some sheriffs became famous through dime novels. Most died anonymously, their names forgotten within weeks. Political connections mattered enormously in keeping your job. Sheriffs who aligned with powerful interests kept their positions. Those who didn't found themselves unemployed or dead under mysterious circumstances. Frontier politics were brutal, and sheriffs were pawns in larger games they barely understood. You enforced laws written by people who'd never faced a gunfight. Religious communities had mixed feelings that bordered on hypocrisy. Churches preached law and order but condemned violence. Sheriffs who killed, even justifiably, were sometimes denied church membership or burial in consecrated ground. You could die protecting Christians and still be considered too sinful for their cemetery. The contradiction was never explained satisfactorily. Ultimately, sheriffs lived in social limbo, belonging nowhere. Too violent for polite society, too lawful for outlaws, too poor for respect, too necessary to eliminate. They existed in the gaps between civilization and chaos, needed everywhere, wanted nowhere. This isolation took a psychological toll that rivaled the physical dangers. Many sheriffs drank heavily, not just for courage, but for companionship. The bottle didn't judge or threaten, others became bitter and cruel, taking out their frustrations on prisoners and suspects who couldn't fight back. A few maintained their humanity despite everything. Those were the rare ones, and they usually didn't last long. Kindness was a liability in a job that rewarded ruthlessness. The social rejection combined with constant danger created men who were fundamentally broken. They'd seen too much, done too much, survived too much. Even if they quit and moved east, they never fit in. The violence stayed with them, visible in their eyes and their hands that always stayed near where their guns used to be. Former sheriffs were ghosts haunting their own lives. So could you handle being a frontier sheriff? If you've made it this far and still think, yes, you've got more courage than sense, which ironically was exactly the qualification most frontier towns were looking for.